From the Arizona Daily Star and Tucson.com, this is the Wildcast.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another special edition of the Wildcast podcast brought to you by the Wildcaster, Arizona Daily Star, and Tucson.com. I say special edition because this is actually our first one for a project we've been working on called, we're going to sort of tentatively call it Wildcaster Live right now. The idea behind it is we're actually going to be bringing you this podcast. If you're listening right now, you're probably listening in one of our normal channels through podcast venues like Spotify and areas like that. We appreciate that. Apple Podcasts. Keep subscribing and listening through that. But if you're watching us, that's because you're seeing us in video form on the Arizona Daily Star website, which is Tucson.com. So this is going to be a new way to bring you this, our conversations and insights from our staff reporters here at the Daily Star, who are the experts on the teams that you love here in Tucson, in new ways. We're going to be able to do this via video, same with audio like we've always done. And the next big goal, which we're really excited about, is actually bringing you into the conversation as audience. So stay tuned to us. Check out at the Wildcaster on Twitter, X, I guess, and on Facebook to keep up to date with when we're going to have some of these upcoming conversations where you get to take part. Today's episode, the first, like I said, video, audio, simulcast, we'll call it, is myself, Brett Fera. I'm the sports editor of the Arizona Daily Star, and I have PJ Brown, our University of Arizona women's basketball beat reporter, with us. We're here to talk a little bit about Wildcat women's basketball heading into a weekend series against Cal and Stanford, a really big opportunity for this team. Obviously, they could go in and win both, and that would be something that earns some headlines if they pulled that off. But a real opportunity, especially against Cal, to get a much-needed win for this team that's been playing really good basketball at times, but just barely missing getting over that hump to pick up some W's over the last couple of weeks. So, PJ, welcome to the show. The first time we're doing this in video form, too.
Yeah. Hi, Brett. Really excited to start this off. We've been talking about it for a while. So to finally get started, it's really cool. And I'm really looking forward to bringing our readers in and being more interactive so we can really hear in real time what their questions are, just everything that they're thinking, and just have a real good conversation with them.
You know, it's so funny when we've been talking about this for a long time. Like you said, it's been me that's kind of been holding it up. I'll admit, sometimes that's the job of the desk leader that kind of sits on things until we get comfortable. But the reason is we want to do it right. We want to make sure that we're vetting people and having, real fan interaction, but that we're also bringing the right people into the conversation. What I mean by that is, we want it to be smart, intelligent conversation. One thing I can tell everybody, and some of these folks probably participated, because I think we got up to close to 700. I want to give Justin Spears, our UA football beat writer, some credit for doing a Twitter or X Spaces event on the day of Jed Fish departing U of A, the football coach departing for the University of Washington. And we had almost 700 people in there conversing about various topics related to UA football and Jed Fish departing and who the next coach would be. So this is literally like 9 days ago. And yet everything in this world of U of A sports seems to have changed overnight since then. But it really showed us that there's an opportunity for this to bring the experts, like I said, PJ on her beats, Justin on his, Michael Lev, longtime UA football beat writer, now columnist and feature reporter for senior writer for our sports department. And of course, Bruce Pascoe covering U of A men's basketball for more than 2 decades now. Really the experts in this city on the teams, like I said earlier, that you guys love and want to know more about. So that said, PJ, let's dive into it. We're not going to make these shows too long because we want to make sure people get to listen to them on their drive in or while they're hanging around. So I'm going to dive straight in. We mentioned the craziness of the last couple of weeks. Most recently, that includes the departure. I will use the word firing if that's how we want to go. Greg Hansen has a column in the Thursday, January 25th Daily Star that really, kind of outlines it was a firing from President Robert Robbins at the University of Arizona of Dave Heeke from his position as athletic director. I wanted to ask you about this. You and I have talked about his impact on women's basketball, meaning Dave Heeke's. Everyone can question, was this justified based on the financial situation of the university, et cetera. But in terms of where his hand and pulse was on certain sports, from what I gather, he has garnered a little bit of respect from the U of A women's basketball program for some of the attention he's been able to pay to them over the last half dozen years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yesterday in Adia Barnes's weekly press conference, she talked about this and about how he believed in her and she believed in him. He supported her. She felt like, she said, he will always be family to me. And as I look back on the 7 years that Dave Heeke was athletic director at the University of Arizona, I remember there's certain points to me that stand out. One was during the WNIT run, when Arizona in the 2018-19 season made the WNIT tournament and ran and won the title. Dave Heeke was the one who bid for all of those games, all 6 games. You had to bid for them, which means he paid to bring them to Tucson, because he knew how important it was to help Adia Barnes put her program back on the map. And so by doing that, and the fan support grew, that title game, they had a sellout at McHale, which was unheard of before that point. And each game leading up to it, they had more and more fans. And to me, all of that was really because Dave decided, I'm going all in, right? We want to help Adia Barnes build her program. And part of this is having postseason, making it easier for her and her team to have postseason here in Tucson. And it was kind of an interesting time, because the men's team they decided not to play postseason that year because of all the things that were happening with NCAA and Sean Miller. And so this was the only basketball in town. And so along with, Adia Barnes getting on Twitter, at that time, just Twitter, and asking people to come out, former players, men's and women's players, buying blocks of tickets.
I think she was auctioning off a date with her husband.
Yes.
So I think she auctioned off, I'm
Yes.
jokingly, but she was joking about that,
joking,
auctioning off a date with Salvo Coppa.
He was not happy about that, let me tell you. So she stopped doing that thing. But it was all of that. Plus,
pulling out all the stops.
Plus, as a paper, I guess I'll just put this out there to pat ourselves on the back. We wrote stories every single day.
Yeah.
Multiple stories. We covered that like if we had a Super Bowl in town, right? That's how we covered that run. And I think all of that helped. And it really started with Dave. Getting back to this, Dave was the one who said, we need to have all these games here. The next time, and I talked to him after that run, and I had a conversation with him. And this is the first time I really had to sit down with Dave. And he said to me, he was on the Adia Barnes train. He said that the first time he came in there and talked to Adia, because she was already here, I believe, a year when he was hired. She was hired by Greg Byrne. And so he said that first conversation he had with Adia, he was like, I'm going to do everything I can to help her. He was on her train. He was all in on helping to build this program. The next time we looked was the 2021 run to the national championship game. And the reason that stands out to me is that during my reporting, I had coaches, assistant coaches from all over the country contacted me because everybody had to be in a bubble during this time. This was a COVID. And so they had to come in a bubble. They had to stay in a bubble. And other programs were not allowing assistant coaches who were moms to bring their kids into the bubble with them. I think one of the only, probably the only school that allowed this to happen was Arizona. And that was Dave. Dave made a conscious decision to say, Adia, you can bring your 5-year-old son, Mateo, and I think Capri was 6 or 8 months old, and Adia was still nursing her. It's not like she could have left her at home. But Dave made that decision that Adia could bring her children. And that was a game changer, because I don't know if Adia could have coached. I mean, she needed to have her children with her. And I don't know if she would have wanted to coach without having them there. And so the fact that Dave said, we're going to do this, just shows how much he supported that program, and he supported Adia Barnes. It was all about family for him.
Well, and
This is what I got.
It built on it too. I mean, to your point, they make the investment, and granted, that's a lot of the debate right now about his efficacy as the athletic director and is the financial elements. But they made the investment in getting those games for the WNAT, which I'm going to guess, and we don't know, and that's something we should probably be looking into. And it's great that we're talking about this because I'm going to make sure that we are in terms of the financial elements of this. And I don't know if I wasn't around here at the time, but I don't know if we did this a couple of years ago, but diving in to determine, was that a moneymaker? Meaning, did that create a little bit of a profit engine? It should be. If you look at the numbers on the attendance, it should have been.
The interesting thing about the WNAT is it's a for-profit, and it's not run by the NCAA. It's run by a for-profit group. And they had to split the ticket sales, the food, all of that stuff. They had to split with the WNAT. And I believe they came out with about 250,000, maybe 300,000 in profit from that run.
Well, so that led into obviously the Final Four opportunity the next year, which then led into hosting the year after.
Yeah.
So the WNIT, while the NCAA obviously is picking the top 16 teams, there's debates, especially in women's basketball compared to men's. There are debates about which teams are going to host that first weekend, where if you're 16th or 17th, you might, I'm being loose on this because I think the committees do their best to make it the top 16, but they have to do what's best for the sport too.
Right.
So there's an argument to be made that if there's two teams directly tied at 16th, 17th, or three teams at 16th, 17th, and 18th overall, that they're going to pick the one they think is going to draw the best. Well, having that WNIT on record to show what Arizona will draw, which we now know is a top 10 team drawing nationally over the last half decade, that led to being able to host that following year, the NCAA tournament, which an NCAA tournament hasn't been hosted in McHale in a decade. So to bring at either sport, so to bring that was such a huge deal.
And one quick thing about that, the last, they hosted just the 1 year because COVID and they couldn't do it that year, and it was all in San Antonio. But Dave had told me that they always bid. So even if they were going to be maybe 18 or 19, they bid because he said there are teams in the top 16 who can't host, right? Who don't want to host, who don't know how to host, can't handle it at their school, whatever. So his mindset was, we're going to bid, and hopefully these teams will, fall out. And if we're not in the top 16, and we can move up and do that. So he always was all in, right? Somebody else may not say that. Somebody might say, oh, we're 20th in the country. We're not even going to bid to host.
And that obviously is the biggest difference between women's basketball and men's basketball at this level is the men are obviously going to neutral sites. The women's basketball, they are on campus those first weekends. So the hosting elements is a big part of it. Speaking of hosting, we'll shift to games coming up here for the Wildcats. They are not hosting. They're on the I'm sorry, they are hosting. I have it backwards. I'm still thinking they're in the Northwest. Like they're playing their third weekend in a row in the Pacific Northwest right now. They are hosting Cal and Stanford this weekend, the last trip to McHale as Pac-12 compatriots for Arizona and Stanford and Cal to be in McHale together. And, Stanford, that's a really big deal because of not just the last 5 years, which has been a monumental opportunity for Arizona to sort of jump into that rank and be considered, in Pac-12 lore and nationally with the Final Four and championship game appearance and the win in McHale, the year, I'm getting the years mixed up. Was that the year prior?
That was 2020 when it got canceled.
And, those games and being able to prove their mettle on a big level is because of Stanford and Tara Vanderveer and what she's been able to do in her news last week. I selfishly for news coverage, I was hoping she'd lose a couple times last week because it means their ranking drops, but at the same time, it means, she comes here and either Arizona beats them or she sets the record here for most wins ever by a Division I college basketball coach. She obviously set it last weekend and will come to McHale this weekend. But what's the opportunity here for Arizona? I mean, we'll talk a little bit about the last half dozen games as well and how close they've been to getting over the hump and getting wins and playing really good basketball in the process. But just being maybe a player short, maybe a couple of minutes short, maybe a shot short. But there's an opportunity here. I mean, yes, upset Stanford, and that would be big news nationally. But simultaneously, getting a win over Cal would go a long way toward solidifying that this team is as competitive as they were the first, 6-7 games of the Pac-12 schedule.
Absolutely. So Cal is better, much better than they were last year. They've gotten some really good pieces. They lost Jada Curry, who was, she went to Louisville, and she was, for the last 2 years, probably most of their offense. So we were all questioning on, how they could put it together when you lose a big piece like that. But Charmin brought in some really great pieces that sort of quickly meshed with everyone else. And she's been able to put together some really good wins. And they're right in the mix of the second group. There's about 4 teams that have 3 wins in the Pac-12 after the top couple teams. And they're doing really well. But, kind of the X factor here for Arizona is the fan base. They always come out, they cheer, the players feed off of the fans, and they talk about it all the time. We ask them about it. So being home is really important right now, especially after, going through this rough time of being away and losing a bunch of games. So to be home for the next 3 games, a possibility of going maybe 2-3. They also play ASU the following week. So if they could finish this little stretch 2-3, that sets them up for a good finish, even though they're playing really tough teams, the USCs of the world, the UCLAs going into that last stretch, as well as Cal and Stanford up in the Bay Area. But these are really important games. If they can win Friday night, it sort of gives them more confidence. Again, it builds that, it helps them. And, this is a time of year where everybody hits the wall. It's a long season. It's the end of January, beginning of February. This is when everybody sort of has to dig deep and get that second wind. And so if they could pull something like that off psychologically, mentally,
right,
then they're also ready for that Stanford game, which I think they're always up for Stanford. And I think they will play really well against Stanford, regardless of the outcome, because Stanford's really hard to beat in any season. But I think that this will just help and carry them a long way if they can just get that first win on Friday night.
Keep the fouls down, keep
Yes.
the minutes balanced among the 7+ players. Friday night, 7:00 at McHale Center against Cal. Sunday, 12 p.m. tip-off against number 6 Stanford at McHale. You mentioned the fans. We're going to talk about this last 5 or 6 games too, maybe to close out our session today. But pivoting a little bit, you mentioned fans, and that was something I wanted to ask. Is this team? They're a good team. No questions. There's been a lot of discussion about how many people are on the roster, about whether the decision made by Adia Barnes was a good one to have only a 10, 11 player roster to start the year. It's easy to cherry pick that at this point and say, see, players got hurt. We told you, but this team competes. They compete. They've played well. To your point, if they can win, a handful of games over the next couple of weeks and stay in contention in the middle of the Pac-12, there's really two ways to go. If they can surprise a couple of teams, they've got Stanford, they've got UCLA, they've got UCLA and USC twice, they've got Stanford another time. They can win some of these, which is a lot. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but if somehow they do and the pieces come together, they'll get right back into that NCAA tournament bubble. If they don't, we just talked about the 2019 season. I get the years mixed up with COVID in the middle, but the 2019 season and the WNIT, this is the prime opportunity to maybe do that again. And yes, hosting may be a different animal with a different leadership in the athletic department, but the fan base is not giving up on this team. They're still showing up. They're still, a significant number of those fans that come every game are season ticket holders. So I imagine no matter what happens down the stretch, as long as they're competing, and I mean that in the broadest term possible, that the fans are going to be there.
Oh, absolutely. This fan base, there's a core of Arizona women's basketball fans and Adia Barnes fans. Some of those fans watched Adia play when she was here back when she played, right? Before she was a coach, before she went overseas and then became a coach, they watched Adia play. And then when she came back, they started coming back really because of her and because they were fans of women's basketball and the program. So those people are there. They're the hardcore fans and they're staying no matter what. And they love that this team has heart and grit. I've talked to a lot of them over the course of this season. And that's one thing that they always bring up. Like, they're excited for the games. They think it's a fun brand of basketball. And the big key is that they have this heart and that they fight and they never give up. And if they do that, it's sometime, they'll break through and have the wins and stuff like that. Sure. But these fans are there with them, and they hang in. They totally hang in. They love the players. The moment a player steps on campus here, they're like, they have 7,500 fans. The moment, and they don't even know them. They haven't seen them play. All of a sudden, Skylar Jones walks on campus and she starts practicing. Everybody wants to know about her. They want to know who she is, what she does. Then they love these players. And it's just, they're all in. It's an amazing fan base for women's basketball here in Tucson.
So depending, and I know there's another postseason tournament that exists in addition to obviously the NCAAs and the WNIT. There's a lot of season left, so we're just talking. But looking at the record today, if this team ends up a WNIT team, the fans they're going to show up for those games. They're not going to sit there and say, well, we've done this before and it's not the Final Four. They're going to be there. I'm supremely confident that they will show up for those games and just be happy they get a couple extra games to watch this season at home.
Absolutely. They'll be there. Doesn't matter. It wouldn't matter if it's an NCAA game, a WNIT, or whatever this new conference, something WBI or something that the NCAA is putting on. It doesn't matter what it is. The fans are going to be there.
So shifting gears, we talked a little bit about this team's ability to compete this weekend, and that directly correlates with what they've done over the last, half dozen games or so. It's been an interesting stretch, since dating back to Colorado coming to Tucson back on January 5th, ranked number 5 in the country at the time, losing by a single point that night, then beating number 15 Utah 2 days later by a single point, then losing in double overtime at Gill Coliseum in Corvallis to Oregon State, then by a single bucket 2 days after that at Oregon, then at Washington by a single bucket. I mean, they got one win out of those 5 games, but yet every single one. And it's so crazy because we're talking about a 500 team, WNIT, yet, and again, it could go either way, but you flip those 5 games the other way. They don't give up three offensive rebounds to Oregon State at the end. Was it end of regulation or the first overtime? I'm trying to remember. It was regulation,
I think it
right?
was regulation, yeah.
Yeah, to give up a tying 3-pointer. You have these games flip the other direction, and all of a sudden at that point they're like 5-0 in Pac-12 play and ranked. I mean, it is that close. The real outlier was the Washington State loss, the most recent game they played. What do you attribute the Washington State loss to compared to these other games that they've been so tight in? Was it just the gas finally was out of the tank after so many close games that was, a 1-4 record over those first 5 games? It just eats at you a little bit that they just ran out of gas against Washington State. And how do you think they propel that into the next set of games? Like you said, that is really important to set up the final stretch of the season.
Sure. I think it's a combination of things. First of all, from talking to some of the players, yes, they got down. I mean, of course, because, you're that close to winning. It's almost a harder loss, I believe, when it's close.
Than getting blown out.
Yeah, because when you get blown out, you were never in it. So it was tough. But on the other hand, it sort of fueled them, and they kept coming back. And if you look at that Washington State game, they played well for one half, an extra 5 minutes. They were right into it. So I think 2 things happened there. One, I think they did hit the wall, right? I think they were gassed. I think that's what happened. And they tried to get their second win, and it just got away from them. The other thing is, Adia Barnes told us after the game that numerous players were sick. They were throwing up before the game, at halftime, all of that. So and she didn't say who it was, but she did say at least one of them was a starter and they had played over 30 minutes. So that can't be easy either. She also mentioned that Helena Pueyo just didn't have legs in that game. If you notice, she missed a few shots early. She just couldn't get the lift or plant or, use her legs just enough. And remember, Helena has played almost every single minute of these games, the double overtime game, the overtime game. I think she's only hasn't played like 5 minutes. I think I counted it up. 5 minutes of 7 games now or 8 games. It's pretty incredible. So at some point that all adds up. I mean, even if they would have won a couple of these games, I think at some point it adds up. It's a lot of miles that they're all putting on. And so that's just really tough. I also think that if once they learn collectively how to win as a team, like some of them have had success in other things, like Helena was on the 21 championship run team, right? Brea and Jada played for USA basketball and they played for a great program. Skylar played for a great program, Whitney Young High School in Chicago. They've won individually elsewhere.
Chicago again.
Yeah, I got to mention Chicago.
You have it. I hear it. You sound, you're like all of us. We've sort of homogenized into, whatever the accent for Tucson is. But when you say Chicago, I hear it. There's a big part of your background comes out in that moment.
Absolutely. That's great.
Sorry, I'm not trying to, I don't want to give you a complex. I love it. You're talking and I'm all of a sudden I hear Chicago and I'm like, I can't even do it. I can't even mimic it, but it's great.
That's great. But for me, it's when they it clicks, right? When they all come together and there's going to be a few games like they knocked off Utah and that was great, but they need to start doing it consistently. And that's when they start figuring it out, making a few less mistakes early on. Like, of course, the last possession counts, but if you get a stop early on and don't take a shot early in the shot clock, right, that's not a shot that you don't normally take and make. If you play team ball on offense and you do like a couple little things, then they start winning these games, and it takes a while to do that.
The thing that stood out to me in the last one was 3-point shooting. That was a struggle early on in the year. You've said it from the start of this season before the games were even played that the high percentage post play shots are going to be what sets this team up for success. But they did have to find a 3-point shot. They just had to, and they did. It took a couple of weeks to the season get going, and all of a sudden they went from really terrible to more than respectable. I mean, their 3-point shooting percentage shot up. In those 6 games, they went, one of them was 37%, one of them was 45%, one was 50%, another at 45%, et cetera. The ones where they were in the games within a bucket. Yeah. 1 for 10, I think 1 for 10 or 1 for 11 against Washington State. So even though they lost by 21 points, you start getting into this rhythm where you're trying to play catch up and having to throw these 3-point shots and they're missing that disparity ends up growing. And so I chalk that up to, sometimes you don't have the shot. Like that doesn't mean necessarily, and I'm sure there were other things, but that doesn't always mean there were other things that weren't going right, but they weren't hitting that shot. And in this era of college basketball, you've got to at least be decent at it. You got to go 35% to stick into games usually. And they weren't. And that sort of ends up creating a bigger disparity than it probably was.
Yeah, that and again, if you excuse me, in this system, if you stop the other team, you can win, right? If you stop them more, right. I believe that Adia said yesterday, and we do have to go back and look at this, but like some of the other teams that she's had offensively don't score as much as this team somehow does, right? So they're averaging, I think now, almost 72 points a game or something like that. I think it went down because of the Washington State game. I think they were averaging about 74 points before that game. And that's more than they typically do. So yeah, they have to hit a few more shots here and there and take smart shots, right? Because there are times when the offense gets stagnant and somebody just doesn't remember that they're not supposed to take that shot, right? Or that's not a shot that they normally take. But it's also making sure the other team doesn't get 3 chances to make a basket, right?
Totally.
To stop those things. Maybe just get a complete stop, right? On the first go around, whatever it happens to be. But,
and those are the legs. That's the gas we're talking about.
Yeah.
When you're playing 35 to 39 minutes a game amongst your starters, a number of your starters, we can't expect a really good player, as great as they may be, to have the same energy level and jump off the ground at minute 39 that they had at minute 1 if they've been doing 39 minutes every single game. So
right.
That goes to the same point. And shifting gears on that, for our last topic, it's not related to U of A, but it's a little bit related to U of A. One of the interesting stories in college basketball this week was what happened at TCU, a team that started the year 14-0. Ended up ranked, a transfer from U of A, Maddie Connor, playing really well. And, at one point had more 3-pointers than Caitlin Clark. I mean, to even think about that is wild. And she was one of a number of Horned Frog players that got hurt. And, they actually had to go to the well and put out an open tryout on campus and somehow found, oh, hey, we've got a handful of state championship basketball players. This is Texas for you, who are on campus as students, not playing college basketball, who can come in and fill some gaps. And sure enough, they go out and won a game midweek against UCF. And, I'm not suggesting that's like the biggest opponent in the world, but it's a big deal emotionally for a team that had to forfeit a couple of games, that has a lot that, I remember last year ASU had to forfeit a couple of games. U of A hasn't been close to that yet. That Oregon State game was getting there. If it got to another overtime, it could have been really interesting with the fouling situation for U of A. But Arizona's roster is one of the things we've talked about all year, and how Adia Barnes chose to keep it really tight. And there's obvious reasons for that. You keep a closer core, and the gelling of the team is stronger when you have a smaller unit. Her ability to work individually and her staff to work individually with each player increases, rather than having, 15 or like the men's team has 19 guys. And I know that there's reasons they can play double scrimmages and do things, but she chose to go shorter. And there's no prediction to it. Everyone can say in hindsight, oh, look at what happened with injuries and they're down to 8 players, but nobody can predict that. You pointed out to me, I want to give you credit, but I'm going to say it to steal it from you at the same time. You said, TCU had 14 players to start the year and they still had the roster issue. So it can happen either way. How has Arizona adapted in that sense to the 8-player rotation they've had to have? And, we've talked about, is it sustainable? It's not, but at the same time, they have to sustain it. How have they sort of managed through it? And is there anything they can learn from TCU, or is it just an interesting sort of side element? And if that doesn't even have anything to do with the connection, obviously, of Maddie Connor transferring there, that's just a coincidence. But where do you kind of see Arizona in terms of this roster right now and being able to sort of hang tough down the stretch for the rest of the season?
Sure. Well, here's the thing. I think that we haven't talked about this yet, but there are a ton of injuries in women's college basketball. I've started keeping a list, and
does it feel like there's more this year than in prior years? I know we've seen big names, the Paige Beckers and players like that have been hurt the past couple of years, but not the quantity we're seeing right now.
Right. It's a lot more. Last year there was quite a bit, but this is much more, and people are still getting.
I have a solution.
Getting that.
Natural grass, not astroturf. No, I'm kidding. Oh, wrong sport.
There you go. That works.
Wrong sport. My bad.
Well, and it's funny because I think Gino Ariema may have said the other day that he thinks it might have been COVID and sort of everything that happened, right? Like players weren't together. They didn't get the normal strength and conditioning, whatever. Adia Barnes didn't think, we asked her about it in the press conference yesterday, and she didn't think that was it. I do think that's part of it. I also think it's probably like baseball, right? The young guys are getting rotator cuff injuries because they start throwing too early, right? And certain pitches too early and all of that. I think with this specialization and playing basketball year round, with the AAU teams and the club teams and the summer stuff, I think it's too much. I think that if they would go back and play like other sports or another sport or took some time off or something, I think some of it is like overuse. I think some of it is maybe that I think there are studies that show that women sort of have more tendency for some of this than the men do because of the way our bodies are built, that
Yeah.
maybe our knees aren't as strong, right? Or something like that. Most of these injuries are knee injuries, by the way. There are some ankles and foots, but a lot of them have been knee injuries that have ended people's seasons. I think it's something that should be studied and talked about
I
more, and that's an issue. But regarding Arizona, teams usually play 7 or 8 rotation anyway. And that's when I went back and looked at Adia's 21 national championship run. The first game against Stony Brook, they blew them out. I think everybody played. And after that, she only played, it was like 7.5 people. So,
which is basically what we're seeing now. We're seeing 7, and there's a core 5. There's 15 to 20 some odd minutes for Skylar Jones and Isis Bay, and then Courtney Blakely's sort of filling in gaps where needed, as that, not calling her half player, but in terms of the numbers, as that player that comes in moments. And so it makes sense in that component that it isn't that different. It's just it's when they get in, like the Oregon State game, I think was the biggest situation that could have been something. I think if I'm not wrong, they were already down to limited players. They had 2 foul out. Is that right?
Yeah, Isis fouled out, I think, at the beginning of in the first overtime, and Brea towards the end of the second, I think.
And then they had, I think, 3 players with 4 fouls. And so depending how that third overtime goes, it would have been a really, really tough situation.
And here's the thing.
So in that situation, you could throw in someone who's not in your rotation and fill space.
Right.
But at the same time, during normal game action, minute 1 through 40, what you're saying is it isn't that different. And it, I don't disagree.
I think the 2 things that come up here are, one, the fact that these games are so close and they've gone to overtime. Had they just won in regulation or lost in regulation, it wouldn't be a thing, but they're doing this and it's every single game. And then they hit the wall in the Washington State game. So now you're saying that everybody's gassed, right? Helena's playing every single minute, basically, of every game. I think that's when we start looking at it and saying, wow, you have to have more than 8 players. The other thing is, in practice, they think about this. They're doing what they're doing without having full-on practices because they can't, because nobody else can get injured, right?
Right.
And that's the thing. And sometimes a lot of these injuries are like no contact injuries or happen in practice. The majority of them are. And you can't then have, the guys are finally back, they're practice players, but there are times when you can't just go one team, right, scrimmage each other. And so those are the things and that become hard. And then that, lead into all of this. But when you think that they're doing what they're doing by watching incredible amounts of film, that when Adia Barnes says, oh, we're really bad at rebounding, and this week all we're going to do is rebounding. And then last weekend they come out and they out rebound both teams. And then in the second game, when they have tired legs from all of this, they're crashing the boards, which they haven't done in forever. I mean, this seems remarkable to me, like how quickly they're learning and getting better at certain things and doing all of this with the limited roster, with all of that. It's sort of, it is really interesting. And again, I don't think that in a normal year without these close games and the fouling, if they wouldn't foul so much, we wouldn't be talking about all of this. It would still be, they only have 8 players, but look at what they're doing now, because if Isis doesn't foul out, get in foul trouble in the last game, some of these games, if Brea cuts down her fouls, as Mary has cut down her fouls lately, she's been on the floor for most of the games, but if a few less fouls and it's easier even for Adia to use her subs and give people more rests at the right time. And this is when,
rather than being forced into it.
Right. And rather than like Helena playing everything and not getting 2 or 3 minutes of rest in every game. Right. So those are the things that fall into it. I don't necessarily think that, TCU, it's a sad situation. They had 14 players, Look at UConn. They have basically a full roster, and they have 5 or 6 kids who are out now for the rest of the season. It's happening across the board.
Well, on that note, I think that's going to wrap it up for us today. We talked a little longer than I wanted, but that's good because there's so much to talk about. We could do this for hours, and we will. The good news is we can do this just about anytime we want, and we're going to have many more of these episodes of the Wildcast podcast and now our new Wildcaster Live video podcast, which will appear at Tucson.com, social media channels. And we're also going to bring, like we said earlier, you, the fan, and our readers who we appreciate dearly into the conversation. This weekend, don't forget, check out all of PJ's stuff at Tucson.com. She's going to have an advance and scouting report leading up to the California game, which is Friday night against Cal at McHale Center, 7 p.m. She'll also obviously have full coverage leading into the last time Tara Vanderveer and Stanford will be at McHale Center as Pac-12 foes. Maybe there's a chance to schedule down the line in the future, but the reality is that for now, this is the last time. That's Sunday, number 6 Stanford at McHale, 12 p.m. tip-off. And we should also note that they'll then have a full week of rest before getting ASU at home Sunday, February 4th at 12 p.m. at a noon tip-off as well. So really, really big opportunity for this team to pick up a couple of wins and continue to hang on in the Pac-12 race. Any last thoughts, PJ, before we sign off today?
No, this was really fun, and I can't wait to do it again. We got so much to talk about.
We can't wait either. Don't forget, subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Find us at The Wildcaster on X and Facebook, and continue to read PJ Brown's coverage of Arizona women's basketball at Tucson.com. I'm Brett Fera, sports editor of The Star. Thanks for watching and listening. We'll see you soon.